The champagne glasses shattered across the marble floor like 1,000 tiny explosions. Senator Morrison's daughter was screaming, pointing at the elderly janitor being dragged toward the exit by two security guards. But it wasn't her voice that made the entire ballroom freeze. It was what she screamed that changed everything. "That's Captain James Mitchell. He saved my father's life in Afghanistan." Everyone in that glittering Washington, D.C. ballroom thought they knew who mattered and who didn't. They were all about to learn how wrong they were. James Mitchell had perfected the art of being invisible. At 68 years old, he moved through the Grand Cascade Hotel like a shadow, his gray custodian uniform blending into the expensive wallpaper, his weathered hands pushing a cleaning cart that squeaked just slightly with each step. The guests never looked at him. Not really. Their eyes would slide past him as if he were part of the furniture, just another fixture in their gilded world. Tonight was the annual Veterans Benefit Gala, and the ballroom sparkled with enough wealth to fund a small country. Crystal chandeliers cast dancing light across tables draped in cream silk, while men in tuxedos and women in designer gowns mingled beneath oil paintings of famous battles. Wars they'd never fought, sacrifices they'd never made. James had been working the hotel for 3 years now, ever since his wife Sarah passed. The job kept him busy, kept his mind from wandering too far into the past. The manager, Mr. Hendricks, barely tolerated him, always watching with suspicious eyes, always finding fault. But James needed this job. His veteran's pension didn't cover the medical bills Sarah had left behind, and pride was a luxury he could no longer afford. "Mitchell!" Mr. Hendricks hissed, appearing beside him like a viper. "What are you doing standing around? The senator's table needs attention. There's water on the floor near table 7. James nodded quietly and made his way through the crowd, keeping his eyes down. Table 7 was surrounded by military brass, generals and colonels, their chests heavy with medals, their wives draped in pearls. As he approached with his mop, he caught fragments of their conversation. The problem with today's military is they don't make them like they used to," a portly colonel was saying, gesturing with his whiskey glass. "Back in our day, soldiers had real backbone." James bit his tongue and knelt to wipe the spill. His knees creaked, old injuries from Fallujah making themselves known. As he worked, his eyes caught on something under the table, a small leather wallet, partially hidden beneath a napkin. He reached for it carefully, his fingers closing around the worn leather. Opening it slightly, he saw a military ID. Lieutenant General Robert Harrison, United States Army. James's breath caught. Harrison. He knew that name, knew that face, though it was older now, marked by time and responsibility. "You there, janitor!" James looked up to see a young man in an immaculate suit striding toward him, face flushed with anger. Chad Morrison, the senator's son, known throughout the hotel staff as someone who treated service workers like dirt. "Did you just take something from under that table?" Chad's voice was loud enough to turn heads. "No, sir, I found—" "Security!" Chad shouted, cutting him off. "This janitor is stealing from the guests." James's heart sank as two security guards appeared, their hands already reaching for his arms. He tried to explain, holding up the wallet, but Chad was already spinning his narrative to the gathering crowd. "I saw him pocket something. These people think they can just help themselves to our belongings." "Sir, I was just returning—" James tried again, but his voice was drowned out. "Check his pockets," someone called out. The guards grabbed James roughly, their fingers digging into his arms as they began pulling him toward the exit. The wallet fell from his hands, skittering across the marble floor. James didn't resist. He'd learned long ago that fighting only made things worse for men who looked like him, men whose military service was hidden beneath civilian clothes and calloused hands. The ballroom had gone silent except for the shuffle of his feet and the whispers of judgment. Shame burned in his chest, not for what he'd done. He'd done nothing wrong, but for the humiliation of it, the assumptions written across every face that watched him being dragged away like a criminal. Then, cutting through the silence like a blade, came a voice James hadn't heard in 15 years. "Captain Mitchell!" The guard stopped. Everyone stopped. A woman was pushing through the crowd, her emerald gown flowing behind her like water, her face stricken with recognition and something that looked like anguish. She was in her early 30s, beautiful in that way that came from strength rather than softness, and her eyes, her father's eyes, were locked on James with an intensity that made the entire room hold its breath. "Let him go right now," she commanded, her voice shaking with barely controlled emotion. "That is Captain James Mitchell. He served 3 tours in Afghanistan. He saved my father's life in Kandahar." The guard's hands loosened, confusion replacing certainty. "Emily?" James whispered, barely able to believe it. The last time he'd seen her, she'd been 17, crying at her father's hospital bedside in Landstuhl, Germany, where James had visited before shipping back to the front lines. Emily Harrison, daughter of Lieutenant General Robert Harrison, stood trembling before the crowd, tears streaming down her carefully made-up face. "My father was pinned down by enemy fire during a reconnaissance mission that went wrong. Captain Mitchell and his unit weren't even supposed to be in that sector, but when they heard the distress call, he disobeyed orders to stay in position. He ran through a minefield? A minefield? To reach my father and 4 other men trapped in that burning vehicle." She turned to face Chad Morrison, her voice turning to steel. "He pulled my father out with his bare hands while the ammunition inside was cooking off. He carried him 200 yards under fire to the extraction point. The doctor said another 3 minutes and my father would have died from smoke inhalation and blood loss." The silence in the ballroom had transformed from judgment to something else. Shock, shame, disbelief. Emily walked forward and picked up the fallen wallet, holding it up for everyone to see. "This is my father's wallet." Captain Mitchell wasn't stealing. He was doing what he's always done, serving others even when no one notices, even when no one thanks him. She turned back to James, and her voice broke. "I'm so sorry, Captain. I'm so sorry they treated you like this. I'm sorry we all did." The ballroom erupted into chaos. Voices overlapped, some apologizing, others defending, many simply shocked into silence. Chad Morrison had gone pale, backing away as if he could disappear into the crowd. Mr. Hendricks looked like he wanted the floor to swallow him whole. But James only had eyes for Emily, this girl he'd once comforted in a German hospital, now a woman who'd just defended his honor in front of Washington's elite. "It's all right," he said softly, his voice rough with emotion. "I'm just the janitor here. You don't need to—" "Don't!" Emily's voice was fierce. "Don't you dare diminish yourself. Not here, not ever." Lieutenant General Harrison himself pushed through the crowd, his face a mask of controlled fury and profound sadness. He was older, grayer, but still carried himself with unmistakable authority. When his eyes landed on James, something in them cracked. "James Mitchell," he said, his voice heavy. "My God." "General Harrison, sir." James straightened instinctively, decades of military discipline impossible to shake. "No," Harrison said, shaking his head. "No, James. What happened? How did you—" He gestured helplessly at the custodian uniform, unable to complete the sentence. James looked down at his worn clothes, his cleaning cart still standing nearby like evidence of how far he'd fallen. "Life happened, sir. Sarah, my wife, she got sick. Cancer, the treatments, the bills. We lost everything trying to fight it. Lost her anyway 3 years ago." He smiled sadly. "This job keeps me going. Keeps me useful." Harrison's jaw tightened. "You should have called me. You should have—" "Called you, sir." James's laugh held no humor. "A general? I'm nobody. Just another veteran who couldn't quite make it work on the outside." "You're not nobody," Emily said fiercely. She turned to address the crowd, her voice ringing clear. "Do you all want to know who Captain James Mitchell really is? He didn't just save my father. After he carried him to safety, he went back. He went back into that burning vehicle 2 more times to pull out Lieutenant Rodriguez and Sergeant Chen. He earned the Silver Star for that action, but they couldn't give him the Medal of Honor because technically he disobeyed orders to get there in the first place." She paused, letting that sink in. "He saved 5 lives that day, and the Army reprimanded him for it. Then they sent him back out for another tour because they needed good men, and Captain Mitchell never complained. He just served. Harrison picked up the story, his voice thick with emotion. James was one of the finest officers I ever commanded. When he left the service, I wrote him recommendation letters for a dozen companies. I thought he'd landed somewhere good. I never knew. He trailed off, the guilt evident on his face. I appreciate that, sir, James said quietly. But those letters, they didn't mean much when the bills started piling up. And after Sarah died, I just needed something simple, something I could do without thinking too much. You were hiding, Harrison said gently. You were hiding from the pain. James didn't deny it. The crowd had grown larger as word spread through the gala. More veterans were pressing forward, and James recognized some faces. Men and women he'd served with, now successful in civilian life, wearing suits instead of uniforms. They looked at him with recognition and shame, realizing they'd walked past him a dozen times in this hotel without truly seeing him. Chad Morrison suddenly pushed forward, his face red. Look, I made a mistake. You thought exactly what you wanted to think, Emily cut him off coldly. You saw a man in a uniform that you considered beneath you and you assumed the worst. You didn't even give him a chance to explain. I'll have you know my father is a senator. And my father is a general who would be dead if not for this man, Emily snapped. Which one of those do you think means more right now? Mr. Hendricks chose that moment to slither forward, his face contorted into an oily smile. Captain Mitchell, I had no idea about your distinguished service. Of course, we value all our employees here at the Grand Cascade. You're fired, by the way, Emily said to him, her voice casual but absolute. Hendricks sputtered. You can't... This hotel is owned by Harrison Hospitality Group, Harrison said quietly. My family's company, and I can personally guarantee that you will never work in hotel management again. Get out. Security, different guards, looking thoroughly chastened, escorted Hendricks out. The man's protest faded into the distance. Harrison turned back to James, and when he spoke, his voice carried the weight of command, but also the warmth of old friendship. James, I'm going to ask you something, and I want you to really think about your answer. Will you come work for me? Not as a janitor, as the Director of Veteran Services for Harrison Hospitality. We have 83 hotels across the country, and I want to create programs to hire veterans, to train them, to give them real careers. I need someone who understands what they've been through, what they've sacrificed. I need someone they'll trust. James stared at him, overwhelmed. Sir, I don't have experience in... You have the only experience that matters, Harrison interrupted. You've lived it, you've survived it, and you've kept going even when the system failed you. He placed a hand on James's shoulder. I failed you, James. I should have followed up, should have checked in. I got caught up in my own career, my own life, and I forgot the men who made that life possible. Let me make it right. James looked around the ballroom, at the faces watching him with a mixture of shame, admiration, and hope. He saw Emily, tears still streaming down her face, nodding encouragement. He saw other veterans in the crowd standing a little straighter, as if his story had reminded them of their own worth. It's not about the job, James said slowly, his voice growing stronger. It's about what it means. For 3 years, I've been invisible. People looked through me, around me, but never at me. I started to believe that's all I was worth, someone whose best days were behind him, someone just filling space until it was time to go. He met Harrison's eyes. But that's not true. Sarah used to tell me that every person we serve, every life we touch, it matters. She said that service doesn't stop just because you take off the uniform. I forgot that. I let the pain and the loss make me forget. Emily reached out and took his weathered hand in both of hers. You never stopped serving, Captain. You just stopped believing that your service mattered. But it does. It always has. James felt something break open in his chest, some dam he'd built to hold back the grief and shame and exhaustion of the past 3 years. Tears he'd been too proud to cry filled his eyes. I accept, sir, he said to Harrison. I'd be honored to serve again. The ballroom erupted in applause. It started with the veterans in the crowd and spread like wildfire until every person in that glittering room was clapping, some crying, many looking ashamed of how they'd dismissed this man moments earlier. But James barely heard it. He was remembering something Sarah had told him in her final days, her hand light as a bird in his. Promise me you won't disappear, James. Promise me you'll let people see you, really see you, because you're worth seeing. He'd broken that promise for 3 years. But standing here now, in his janitor's uniform surrounded by generals and senators, and the daughter who'd recognized him when no one else would, he realized he'd been given a second chance. Not everyone gets one of those. 6 months later, James Mitchell stood in a conference room at Harrison Hospitality headquarters, leading a training session for newly hired veterans. He wore a crisp suit now, but he'd kept his old custodian uniform in his office, a reminder of how quickly we can become invisible and how important it is to truly see each other. The program had already hired 200 veterans across the company's hotels, giving them not just jobs, but careers, dignity, and community. James had created mentorship programs, mental health resources, and a network that ensured no veteran working for Harrison Hospitality would ever feel alone or invisible again. Emily Harrison had become the program's fiercest advocate, using her position and voice to expand it nationwide. She visited James often, and they'd developed a friendship built on mutual respect and shared understanding of sacrifice. On his desk, James kept 2 photographs. One was of Sarah smiling in the garden behind their old house, reminding him that love persists beyond loss. The other was from the gala night, showing him standing between Harrison and Emily, no longer invisible, no longer forgotten. Chad Morrison had apologized profusely and, to his credit, had joined the Veteran Hiring Initiative, using his father's political connections to expand the program to other companies. Sometimes, James reflected, people could grow when forced to confront their own prejudices. But the real change had happened in James himself. He'd learned that healing doesn't mean forgetting, and that service takes many forms. Sometimes the bravest thing you can do is let yourself be seen, flaws, scars, and all, because everyone, no matter their uniform or title or circumstance, deserves to be seen for who they truly are. And sometimes it takes losing everything to remember that the most important thing we can give each other is recognition, not of what we do, but of who we are and always have been. Worth seeing, worth knowing, worth remembering.